Good afternoon. This is Pastor Bob Uzzle from the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Corsicana, Texas. I am hoping everybody is having a good day. Today is June the 12th, 2020. Today is Loving Day. Many people have never heard of that. Several years ago, I posted an item on Facebook about Loving Day, and somebody said, well, every day is Loving Day for me. Well, that's nice. But obviously, the person who made that comment didn't know what Loving Day was. And if there's anybody who's listening today doesn't know, well, I'm fixing to tell you all about it. Loving Day, June 12th, is remembers the June 12th, 1967 Supreme Court decision, Loving versus Virginia. Right here is a picture of a man and a woman who made history on this day. That was 53 years ago. Richard Loving and his wife, Mildred Jeter Loving. Richard was white. Mildred was a mixture of African American and Native American descent. Their marriage literally changed history. Many states of the Union in 1967 had laws against black and white marriage. Some of these laws went way back. Where did they originate? Well, there's no question. They were passed during the same time that slavery was gaining statutory recognition. These laws were remnants of slavery. That's a fact of history. No ifs, ands, or buts about that. And these were the last of the Jim Crow laws that finally got the boot. And it's interesting that in 1967, Virginia, a state that often celebrated the marriage of one of its white sons to an Indian princess, had one of the strongest anti-miscegenation laws in the country. Miscegenation, from Latin, miscere means to mix, genus means race or kind, race mixing. And these laws were passed in many states, including my home state of Texas. But they remained on the books a long time. Richard and Mildred had grown up together in Caroline County in a community called Central Point. And that was a historic melting pot. And they fell in love and wanted to get married. Many states, as I say, had laws regulating marriage in this way. And the courts had dealt with it in various ways. The courts in the South had generally upheld such laws as being constitutional. And the only exception to this was in 1948, when the California Supreme Court, in the case of Perez versus Sharp, struck down the state anti-miscegenation law. And by the way, this was the only state in which, the only case in which religious freedom became an issue. Both Andrea Perez and Sylvester Davis were members of the Roman Catholic Church. In Catholicism, marriage is a sacrament, and thus they would not be able to receive one of the sacraments of their church as a result of the fact that they could not get married at the time in Los Angeles County. Well, in 1948, California's law was struck down, but that had no bearing outside of California. You can go back to 1883 in the case of Pace versus Alabama, in which a black man named Tony Pace was living with a white woman named Mary Jane Cox in Clark County, Alabama. And they could not legally get married. But the law stated that, they had punishment for people living together who were not married, these cohabitation laws. But a mixed couple had a heavier fine than a couple of the same race. Hypothetically speaking, you could have 3 couples living next door to each other, unmarried. You could have a white couple, a black couple, and a black and white couple. I don't know exactly what the fines were, but it could be that the white couple and the black couple would both pay $50 fines. The interracial couple would pay a $100 fine. And the U.S. Supreme Court upheld that in Pace versus Alabama. They said there was no discrimination there as long as the white party was punished as much as the black party was, it was a-okay. Yes, blacks are prohibited from marrying whites, but whites are prohibited from marrying blacks, so it's equal. That was the argument. And that held up until 1964, in the case of McLaughlin versus Florida, where in Miami, a black man named Dewey McLaughlin was living with a white woman named Connie Hoffman. And again, they had a heavier fine to pay, more penalty because they were an interracial couple. Well, this case in which the Supreme Court did not issue an opinion at all about Florida's anti-intermarriage law, because it was not germane to the case, they did rule that that law was unconstitutional because it was punishing the black party more than the white party. In one of the concurring opinions, Justice Potter Stewart wrote that it's simply not possible under our Constitution for the criminality of an act to be determined by the race of the actor. And that paved the way for Loving versus Virginia. 1958, Richard Loving married Mildred Jeter in Washington, D.C., where it was legal. They tried to settle in Caroline County, Virginia. Sheriff Garnett Brooks arrested them in the middle of the night. And he arrested them because they had violated the state anti-miscegenation law, and they had fled the state, he said, in order to commit a crime. They showed him their marriage license in D.C. He told them that didn't count in Virginia. I have heard he was hoping to catch them having sex, which would have been another law they would have been violating, but he didn't. He did not come in at the right time to do that, so he wasn't able to charge them with that. But they were hauled off to jail, and Judge Leon Bazile sentenced them to a year in jail for violating the Virginia anti-miscegenation law. However, he told them that he would suspend the sentence if they would leave Virginia and not return together for 25 years. They moved to Washington, D.C., lived in a dump. They missed the country life and wanted to come home. In 1964, when the debate was taking place about the passage of the Civil Rights Act, Mildred wrote a letter to Bobby Kennedy, who was then Attorney General. Unfortunately, there was nothing in the 1964 Civil Rights Act that actually dealt with her case, but it was carried. He referred the case to Bernie Cohen, an attorney affiliated with the American Civil Liberties Union, who agreed to take the case pro bono. He was later joined by another civil rights lawyer named Phil Hirschkopf. And in an interview later, Bernie Cohen described this as a simple letter that got them involved in a not so simple case. And he said, they didn't understand the case. Richard Loving had a crew cut. He was what we'd probably look up today as a redneck, a simple country boy. He neither Richard nor Mildred had a high school diploma. They were some very plain people. And Richard earned his living as a carpenter and bricklayer. His favorite hobby was racing hot rods. There was not a whole lot. You know, he was not a person you would expect to find involved in a case like this. And he couldn't understand why Bernie Cohen could not go to Judge Bazile, get him to rescind the order, let him come back home. He said, it's not that simple. It's a very complex case. And he said this case will go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Richard's jaw dropped. He said, it's going to take a few years. We're going to have to go to the court where we started. We'll lose there. We got to go to the appeals court, the Virginia Supreme Court. They're going to rule against us. But once this case hits the U.S. Supreme Court, this is not going to stand, because it is unconstitutional. And so the case, it was carried to the Supreme Court. They agreed to hear it. And finally, they got their day in court on June the 12th, 1967. Well, that's not the day that the case was argued. That's the day that the court finally rendered decision. The Virginia Supreme Court, the Virginia Attorney General's office sent their representatives there to try to argue the constitutionality of the state's racial integrity law, but they didn't win. It was Richard pointed out. He refused to go to actually hear the proceedings, and he was asked, "What do you want me to tell him?" He said, "Mr. Cohen, tell the judges I love my wife, and it's just not fair that I can't live with her in Virginia." Well, by a vote of 9-0, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned these laws. As I say, McLaughlin versus Florida 3 years earlier had paved the way for this case. And they declared every state that had a law against interracial marriage, these laws were null and void. And they were able to return to Virginia, settle in Caroline County in Central Point. Richard built a house for Mildred, which she lived in the rest of her life. They had 3 children altogether, a daughter named Peggy and sons Sidney and Donald. Sadly, in 1975, they were hit by a drunk driver, and Richard was killed instantly. Mildred lost an eye in that accident. She continued to live in that same house and never remarried. She raised her children and grandchildren. She died of pneumonia in 2008. For a number of years now, they've been celebrating Loving Day, and they have loving conferences throughout the country on or around June the 12th to celebrate this very important decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. I never had the pleasure of meeting Mildred. Deborah and I talked with her on the phone a number of times before she died. In my opinion, Mildred Loving is just as important to the civil rights movement as Rosa Parks, whom I did have the pleasure of meeting. And incidentally, June 12th 1981, our son, Robert Elton Uzzell, was born. He was very well aware of the fact that he was biracial and that he was born on Loving Day. Honestly, it wasn't planned that way. That's just the way it happened. Today would have been his 39th birthday. This last November, he passed away, and so giving this video is a bittersweet experience. We sure do miss him. He's done some YouTube videos in the past. I don't know how many of them are still on there, and I can't say I would take credit for everything he did. Each generation has their issues. My father didn't agree with me on everything. I don't agree with my son on everything, but I still love him, and I still miss him very much. But one time he did devote a program to Loving versus Virginia. That was during the time, several years ago, there was a judge in Louisiana named Keith Bardwell who refused to marry interracial couples, and as a result he was pressured to resign, and there was a little controversy over that, and part of the argument was that children of interracial marriage have a hard time. Quote, it's bad for the children. This was about 2009, and one could, with the inauguration of Barack Obama, it was obvious that the child of interracial marriage could grow up and become president of the United States. That's what could easily happen. And but this is a very important day. There's vestiges of racism still with us today, as anybody who's kept up with the news doesn't, with the recent death of George Floyd and all the protests and demonstrations. Deborah and I got married on February the 19th, 1977 in Fairfield, Texas. There was a bomb threat at the church. No bomb. But that was the mentality at the time. This was only 10 years after the Loving decision. Today things are much better. But there's been a lot of things said about racial profiling and stereotyping, and it's, to me, many things people think are just normal assumptions based on statistics, to me are outright racist assumptions that we need to be on guard against. For example, you have a gathering of people, predominantly African American. There's one white male and one white female there. They're not sitting together. They're not anywhere near each other. Somebody makes a conclusion, oh, is this your wife? No. And that's a racist assumption even to say that, unless they were together and there was some reason they were showing affection to one another. There's no reason to believe it's just because two people of the same color and have to be at the same location that they're involved in a marriage or romantic relationship. And Dr. Martin Luther King complained that the 11 o'clock hour on Sunday is the most segregated hour of the week. And while there's been some progress over the years, we're not totally away from that yet. And for various private business and government agencies, they have programs of affirmative action, which churches are totally exempt from. And the house of God is where it ought to start. And some churches don't want a pastor who's of one race and a first lady who's of another race. And that is very unchristian. And these are some of the issues we're still battling 53 years after Loving versus Virginia. I dedicate this video to the memory of Richard Loving, Mildred Loving, two pioneers, and to my son Robert Elton Uzzell. This is his first birthday following his departure from this world. Son, I really miss you. I really love you. God bless everyone today.